DNA testing can determine where in Africa our forebears were from. Among those using the test to trace their family's past, Spike Lee, Oprah Winfrey, and actor Isaiah Washington, one of the stars of Grey's Anatomy.
Brother Washington, your mitochondrial DNA is quite common among the Mende and Temne people in Sierra Leone.
Trace their ancestry back to Africa, a history totally lost to them.
If you think about young African Americans growing up thinking that the history started with slavery, I mean, how do you think that impacts their psyche? We went through slavery, we didn't start with slavery.
To Vi Higginson, the prospect of tracing even a tiny fraction of her ancestry back to Africa was enthralling. 60 Minutes sent her DNA to African Ancestry, as well as to several other genetic genealogy companies, to see what they could tell us about Vi's maternal lineage.
I'm sitting on the edge of my seat.
Kittle's company sent Vi what they call a certificate of ancestry.
Oh my God.
It says that you share maternal genetic ancestry with people from the Mende tribe in Sierra Leone. Do you know anything about Sierra Leone or the Mende people?
No.
Nothing.
Nothing.
People have been waiting a lifetime for something like this. Now, this is just a tiny bit of information now.
But they take it as huge.
Right, because it's cracking open the door that was closed for centuries.
There's a place in Africa you could say that I'm from.
A tribe?
A tribe? I am thrilled. It puts a name, a place, a location, a people. It opens up such possibilities.
But the problem is, Sierra Leone wasn't the only answer Vi got. A company called Relative Genetics found a match to a single person in the Wobi tribe in the Ivory Coast.
Different?
Different.
Now, I got all excited about that, and this is different? Now, how could that happen?
Then a third company, Trace Genetics. Your particular sequence matches sequences reported among multiple Mendenka individuals in Senegal.
What's up with this?
And Family Tree DNA, the company that linked Vi with Marion in the first place, came up with a whole list of matches. This goes on and on.
My goodness.
So what do we know about Vi's ancestry? The DNA does indicate that she has distant relatives in the Mende tribe, but she also has relatives in all those other tribes. So no one can say for sure where Vi's maternal ancestor actually came from. When I handed Vi the certificate, she got extremely emotional about it. She wept, and it meant so very much.
People want to believe.
They want to believe they've gotten an answer.
And it's not fair of us to let them believe that we're giving them certain answers, because scientifically, we just can't.
Hank Greeley is concerned that the science isn't really there yet for you to be giving them the name of a tribe.
I think for most companies, I would be concerned too.
But what about your own company?
We have
He
the
didn't
largest...
exclude you. He included you.
But we have the largest set of sequences from Africa. And so with that, we're able to provide some level of probability in terms of frequency.
But he would say that even though you have the largest database, it's still small on the scope of things.
As I said, I share those concerns.
About yourself.
Our DNA.
And that's the rub. This business of genetic genealogy is fraught with limitations. For one thing, it can only provide information about a tiny fraction of our ancestry. Because we get half our DNA from our mothers and half from our fathers, almost all of our DNA gets shuffled and remixed every generation, making it impossible to trace what comes from whom. There are just 2 bits of DNA that remain pure: the Y chromosome, which passes directly from father to son, and something called mitochondrial DNA, which passes unchanged from mother to child. Hank Greeley, a law professor at Stanford University, has studied this new field. He worries that people don't realize just how many ancestors they actually have.
8 generations ago, both you and I had 256 great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents.
Wait, you're saying that if you go back 8 generations, we have 256 great-great-great-grandparents?
Yes, it doubles every generation. So you've got 2 parents, you have 4 grandparents, you have 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, and it adds up fast. It adds up so fast, in fact, that if you go back 20 generations, you've got over 1 million grandparents.
1,048,576 to be exact. And in each generation, DNA testing can provide information about only 2 of them.
So you could be Peruvian on your mother's 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 side, Japanese on your father's 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 side, Swedish on everything else.
And you'll never know.
And you'll never know the Swedish from the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial DNA.
Now, you've looked at several of these companies that are doing these tests.
Yes.
Do you think that they explain what you just explained to us?
No, I don't think any of them does as good a job of pointing out the limitations. But, businesses often don't go around telling you how weak their product is.
We don't oversell. I mean, we just say, look, we provide a service. If you're interested in exploring a tiny bit of your DNA and trace its ancestry, we can do that.
When you say it's a tiny little amount,
It's less than 0.1%.
and that's pretty teeny.
Yeah, but for people who know nothing about any of them, I think it's very important.
When Oprah was finally in the first series, and we gave her DNA test, basically the next day she went to South Africa to announce that she was opening what became the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy. She was in an auditorium like 75,000 people or something, and she announced that she just had the test and that she was Zulu. So it broke on CNN. I was sitting in my living room minding my own business and said, Oprah Winfrey's a Zulu. So I called Rick Kittles, and I said, Rick, did you tell Oprah she was a Zulu? He goes, no, man, she made that up herself. It's a true story. It's a true story. I would lie to make you laugh, but I'm telling you a true story. So I said, Rick, are you in your lab? He said, yeah. I said, is anybody there? He said, no. I said, when the results come in, make her Zulu, man. I said, you back there making it up anyway. Nobody believe you could take some spit and figure out a tribe? What are you, crazy?
Twent, Banaka, greetings, Pikwa, everyone. Chief Eagle Elk, I have a very special show, very special program. We have Dr. Fatu, and we have Chris, who is a geneticist and owner of Native DNA. If I can get everybody to mute, please. And if you can hold your questions to later on, I'll actually give the prompt for anyone when we start the questions and answers. But meanwhile, if everybody can just keep it muted, that would be awesome. That'd be great. But Chris is the owner of Native American DNA. And his DNA company is a little different, which is why he's on his show. And the things that we're getting ready to talk about, you'll see why it's different. I'm not going to spoil it by trying to speak about it. I'm going to hand it over to the experts in a minute. Dr. Fatu, can I get you to introduce yourself and the journey that your path in this DNA field, and then I'll have you to introduce yourself, Chris.
I'm Dr. Fatu Diarra. That's how people know me, Dr. Fatu Diarra. I'm a practicing internist, okay? And I've always been interested, for many of your listening audience, if they've heard my lectures before, my dad is from Ghana. He was from Ghana, and my mom was from Northeast North Carolina, Halifax County to be exact. And I always was very much interested in learning about her history, and I was limited, okay? But I always knew there was something hidden and deep about my mom's lineage. And I knew a lot about my dad's lineage because my dad would teach me about his lineage, about his tribe, about the history of the tribe, the migrations. And I always had a passion. That's just a natural passion that I have for history ancient history. I was always into that, but something was always missing with my mom's side. And I don't come from a line of strong oral history. I know some people do in the Afro-American communities, and people who belong to the tribes have the vantage point of being able to locate their ancestors on records. Well, most of my ancestors were not free people of color. Only a small portion of them were. So that means that the majority of my lineage stops on in terms of the paper trail at 1970. And, you know, now we have people who are skilled, who have ways of navigating even before, even for those enslaved lineages, they're finding out different little things, but that's besides the point. There's still, you know, roadblocks and challenges with that. So I got into DNA to supplement that. And the other thing too, for some people, I started looking at DNA tests of people who belong to tribes, because people who belong to tribes have a strong oral history. There's not really a debate there's no debate as to who they are. So I started looking at DNA studies on the Lumbees, DNA studies on the Wampanoag. I started paying attention to so-called African-American people DNA patterns and Caribbean people DNA patterns. And I started noticing a pattern. Now, I would be wrong if I don't mention Tyrone Lewis Cannon, because Tyrone Lewis Cannon really brought it to light how in his study, he looked at a few hundred samples of so-called African Americans who took 23andMe, and 88% of us had Southeast Asian Native American markers. And when you add the Native American markers to the Southeast Asian markers in 23andMe, it was almost 100. It was 99.5%. Okay, that's a huge number. And if anybody just looks at their relatives, anybody who's so-called African American who looks at their relatives and 23andMe at their results, they will notice it is hard pressed to find any one of us who do not possess a tiny amount of Southeast Asian DNA. And, you know, I've explained this on numerous interviews that what happens with 23andMe, the reason why he used 23andMe is 23andMe doesn't hide any of the percentages. Many of the mainstream DNA testing companies reserve the right not to report percentages if they are under a particular threshold that they determine is that they want to use as a cutoff point. And that's their right. But the only disadvantage of that is that if you don't have that understanding, then you think that if you do ancestry DNA, just to throw them out, it could be MyHeritage or any one of them, if Native American, the Asian-derived population that we're calling Native American, if we don't see any percentage show up, then the thought or the instinct is to think that it's zero, but it's not necessarily zero if you use third-party tests or a company like 23andMe that tends to bear it all and show you those percentages, even if they're under 1%, under 2%. You understand? So using a company like 23andMe, where they reveal the Native American and the Southeast Asian DNA, has been really revealing, because for almost 100% of the test population to have those tiny markers suggests that a part of the lineage of the people had to be here from ancient times, because why? The people that were terming Native American migrated here 10,000 years ago. You understand? So that's a long time, and there was intermixing that took place. But where I come in, is that there's been an othering of the people of the Eastern Woodland tribes and of many Afro-American people who have a strong indigenous lineage to this land because of the African DNA. So I took it upon myself to study the patterns of this African DNA, and I've learned that not all African DNA is the same. You have the Bantu type DNA, you have the West African DNA. And what I've observed over the years is that it's the Bantu DNA that's actually more ancient than the West African DNA. As a matter of fact, if you look at the DNA analysis of West Africans, the older part of them goes back to the Bantu areas from the Great Lake area and Pygmy population. So once I started, and you know, Chris Lusakis of Native DNA, who's here with us, he confirmed what I was observing because it was from Mr. Lusakis that I learned that Polynesians had on average 20 to 25% Bantu DNA, okay? It was, and you know, a lot of that is not known to the average layperson because DNA is, people are categorized by genetic communities. So if someone from Hawaii, Tahiti, or any of the Polynesian islands, for example, take a DNA test, they're allocated to the genetic community. The genetic community does not reveal what's inside that genetic group, but someone like Mr. Lusakis gets to see what's inside that genetic group. So what he did by, you know, because, you know, he'll explain himself, but Hawaiian DNA is something personal to him because of his father's lineage. He's also part Hawaiian in ancestry, so he took it upon himself to dive into Polynesian DNA, and he found out that they do have a small percentage that is Bantu DNA. And then just doing my own reading, I found out that a company called DNA Consultants identified a gene called the Mozambican gene, and Mozambique is in the Bantu area, and they discovered that there are groups like some Tibetans, some Afro-Americans, and some Navajo natives that have this Mozambican gene. So I started really taking a look at that, and I realized that this Bantu DNA is in fact global. And of course, I've looked at ancient skeletons and the sequencing of ancient skeletons like Otzi, who's a 5,000-year-old frozen mummy found in the Alps of Europe. If you look at the ancestral composition of Otzi, if you look at his Jed kit on the GEDmatch site, you'll see that the earlier portions of Otzi is Pygmy and Bantu. And then my husband, he's Lebanese, and I looked at his DNA, and if you look at the earlier portions of his DNA composition, you will also see that he has a little bit of Bantu, he has different African groups, Mandinka, Yoruba, and stuff like that, but he also has the Hadza people who are hunter-gatherer Bantu people. He has a little bit of Pygmy. So I realized these are primordial populations that were indeed global. And Native DNA helped me to also put it this way, I may have hunches, but he helped reconfirm that what I concluded was in fact true. So what happens is that fast forward today, that part of our DNA is not respected because there's only one narrative that's told about the early people of the Americas. And I'm not taking anything away from the Asian-derived population. They were here from ancient times, so that has to be respected. But there is a dismissal of people who do have African-type DNA, which is also very ancient. And as a matter of fact, I even showed in one of my lectures the sequencing, because 23andMe does a very basic sequencing. And there is a sequencing app called sequencing.com, but 23andMe does their own version of sequencing, which they call a timeline. It's very rudimentary, but it's still revealing. So when I looked at an example of a Mexican from the state of Oaxaca, which is on the Pacific side, and this is found among some Central Americans and some Mexicans, they do have the Austronesian markers or the Southeast Asian markers that many of us have, or majority of us have. Actually, when I looked at this particular Mexican's timeline, you will see that in his timeline that the Native American was towards the end. It came in later. You would see that his founder populations was Bantu, Southeast African, Angolan, Pygmy, and Southeast Asian. So that is the same type of pattern that we see with people who belong to the Eastern Woodland tribes who take 23andMe. That's the same type of pattern that you see with many so-called African Americans who take 23andMe. What we share with the people from Mexico is the initial, earlier founder population, and then the Native American came later. The people that we are terming Native American, which is really a particular type of Asian-derived people that migrated here, and that is what they're referring to as Native American. And they were different migrations here. There were different people who came here. And what I love about Native DNA is that even before I met Mr. Lousakis, I had done so much studies, participated in so many DNA companies. If it was out there, I participated in it. And what I saw using my mother's DNA, using your parents' DNA, Lavelle, using so many people, using many of my patients who come from various backgrounds, I started to see a certain type of pattern. And so what I was seeing for many of us who are Afro-American or even people who belong to the tribes, we would have matches to the people of North Africa, the Berbers. I would see evidence that we have matches to people from Ethiopia, Northeast Africa, matches to the Mediterranean, Greece, Pakistan, India. Of course, we have the European, we expect that, but I didn't expect things like Sardinia and stuff like that. And of course, matches to the Basque people. Now, when I met Chris, I developed even more understanding because through his company, I started to see these same populations popping up, not only for myself, but for many people that also participate who belong to our ethnic group, who belong to tribes, who belong outside of tribes. And Chris, oh my God, I've never ever dealt with a company like this. You get one-on-one explanation. You email him, you go to his messenger, whatever. Email is best because I get to actually keep it, because I sometimes forget. The information is so vast. And I ask him the question, he gets back, he explains it. Why so many of us are getting vast? Because I participate in genetic groups and we share our results. And I'm like, why are so many Afro-Americans and people in the tribes, outside the tribes, why are we getting vast? What's up with this? And he explained that there was a trade relationship in ancient times or pre-Columbian times between the Basque people, who are an ancient people of Europe, and Native American people, indigenous people. And this is how we gain their markers. It's not something new. And also, he has helped with genealogy. Not only did he confirm the findings of different groups mixing in with our population from pre-Columbian times, he actually showed the genetic matching, what happened during the slave trade, for those of us who come out of that lineage as well. I mean, it's just been very helpful. And let me tell you something. His DNA test is so on point. He literally helps in terms of your research because, genealogy is a lifelong mission. No matter how much you find, you keep moving and going back. The more you find, the more you want to find. So it's like a lifelong type of project, and you end up passing it on. And his test results help actually with that. It helps narrow it down, and it's an excellent tool to actually use. So
let me break in here for a second, Dr. Fatou.
Yes.
Forgive me for cutting you off. You said a few things that I want to expound on before we turn it over to Chris, and because you've already paved the way for him to take the baton and just go wide open with what he has to offer. But you said a few things. You said the slave trade. You said ancient DNA, and you said something else I can't remember. But here's the thing. You've heard me mention this quite a few times. You have a unique perspective because you have one parent who's from Ghana, who's from Africa, and you have one parent who's from the state I live in, North Carolina.
Right.
You're not out here trying to paint a picture, create a narrative that everybody who looks like us is an Indian. No. And let's get this out. Let's go ahead and get this out the way. Indian and these are words we did not create. So people out there in the YouTube verse, when you hear me use these words, please don't start commenting about me using words that, you know, Aboriginal, Indian, Indigenous, whatever. We didn't create those words. All tribes have a description of themselves, a name that they call themselves. For us, we call ourselves Oklahoma. You know, each nation in this country has a way to describe themselves as being the first people, or the principal people, or the real people, the people. For us as Oklahoma, not Aboriginal, not Indian, not Indigenous. These are terms that we use for different reasons, and we use them loosely. In law, they recognize Indian. So we use all these words. We know the definition, etymologies, and where they come from. But in conversation, you know, we shouldn't feel like we're on trial every time we use a word. And if you're going to use a word and use that word and weaponize that word, you know, that speaks a lot to your character to start with, and it shows your maturity. It shows your maturity. You're not that mature. So, yeah, you have a parent from Africa and you have a parent from North Carolina, from America here. Ancient DNA. In America, we need to be intellectually honest and accept what it is. Don't make stuff up. Accept what it is. And you know, African shows up. People who look African American, African is going to show up in your DNA. You can't make it go away. But most people are afraid of the slave trade. They're trying to say that it didn't happen.
Oh God.
It did happen, but you may not. Now, here's the thing, Chris, Dr. Fatu. In my family, we have family historians, and our family records have been preserved pretty darn well. I've been able to go back, believe it or not, to the 1400s. I think the earliest I went was 1300s, which took me to Europe.
Wow.
These Europeans who came over here and married indigenous women and had babies. Then you had Africans who came over here and took indigenous women and had babies, and all kinds of mixing took place. This is a mixing bowl. So you can't say slavery didn't happen, because we have, you know, it's well documented. Slavery did happen, but you may not have had an ancestor come during that period from Africa. It could have been a different time frame when they came here. The historians in my family, one of our historians has written a family tree book that's going to be in the Smithsonian. So I questioned him, because none of the other historians, whether it's the Mitchell Spalding historians, the Freeman Jacobs historians, the Moore Mitchell historians, we have for all of our family lines, we have multiple historians. And I mean, very seasoned historians who know the families. You know, they know every nook and cranny, every secret of our families. And if it was a rumor, they know if that rumor was based in fact or fiction. They know the families. So this one particular cousin, he lives in Buffalo, and he came down here. He gave me the book he wrote. He was my last hope to see if he discovered somebody who came over during the transatlantic slave trade. He has not found anyone. None of our family historians have found anyone during that time period. But African does show up. So here's the point. You had Africans trading, Africans coming, Africans settling, mixing for a very long time. And then if you want to go back to everything came out of Africa, well, they left a genetic footprint everywhere they went. Every landmass they went to, they left a genetic footprint. I'm not a geneticist or have the background that Dr. Fatu has, but I have studied enough to know that I studied the archaeologists and I studied their research and seeing the migration patterns, and it came all the way over to the Americas. That goes back to that ancient DNA you were talking about. So Dr. Fatu, you were sharing with me that when you see like 2% Native American DNA, most people see that and they say, "Oh, I barely have any Indian in me." But you learn something else about reading DNA that the layperson does not get. Can you explain that when seeing those low percentages like that?
Yes. Well, in general, the lower percentages are consistent with the most ancient presence in general. That's usually what it's a reflection of. Usually that 2% reflects ancient mixing. And the larger percentages are what came in later or in more recent times.
Okay.
When you look at the sequencing, you will notice that the Native American DNA, for the most part, is adjacent to the Bantu type DNA, whether it's the Southeast African or whether it's the Angolan, depending on whatever reference they're using for that particular company. You will see that they are usually adjacent. You will generally not see the Native American. I'm talking about sequencing. You will generally not see the Native American adjacent to the Mandinka or the Ghanaian DNA. You may sometimes see it adjacent to the Yoruba DNA because the Yoruba people had colonies over here in Mexico and in South America and the Caribbean and a little bit of the Southeast just by diffusion. So a lot of people here, and what I'm about to say is controversial, but I can back it up. And there are sources. You just got to know how to read it. The slave trade indeed happened, but the infusion of West African DNA, not Bantu type DNA, but the infusion of West African DNA primarily was the cleansing out of Europe. That's not taught. I have sources that talked about the large presence of African people in London. There was a whole population of Moors that ran out of the Iberian Peninsula during the Inquisition and settled in England, and there was already an established African population. It was diverse that came there during the Roman period. I mean, you have Uptown Girl, who was 33% Isan Yoruba DNA, and it was thought to come from her grandfather, who was 100%, and her grandfather was said to be a noble. So you had a lot of Africans of West African type DNA that was living in Europe, and it was a multitude of populations. You will see when you look at the sequencing app that many of us acquired the Senegambian Portugal DNA all around the same time with some of our British DNA, and you will see them juxtaposed. It's hard to describe what I'm saying without visually looking at it, but I do use the sequencing app. So what I get to see is that I see the time stamping when different ethnicities converged. And what I saw, let me speak for my mother's lineage or her genetic sequencing. What I saw was that my mother had Portuguese DNA or Iberian DNA. I saw that it was right adjacent to the Senegambian DNA, and that was adjacent to the British DNA and all converging around the same time as the North Indian, Pakistan, and Balkan DNA. Now, if you sit around and you just think about that, where was all of those people at the same time on this planet? That was England. In the 1600s, you will have some of our people getting Sri Lankan matches to South India, not so much Pakistan. Think about it. Who were the Lascars? The Lascars were the naval seamen. They were the seamen during the British Empire. And you had a number of Lascars living in England in the 1600s. And when you talk about certain lineages like the Weavers and certain people who descend from Indian indentured servants, did anyone bother to ask where those Indians came from. They did not come from India directly. They actually came from England. Well, what a lot of people don't know, but increasing amounts of us are learning, is that that's actually where a lot of the African people also came from. They came from these European countries, and they came, particularly a lot of them came from England. So this is why the indentured servants that came in the 1600s had these Portuguese type surnames, because they really were the descendants of the Portuguese or Iberian Moors that ran into England. And you will, if you read Paul Heinrich's work, you will also notice that many of them did their indentured servitude, and then they, some of them were going to courts. We're talking 1600s, going to court, suing their bondmaster. Now, let's just use a little bit of common sense. You can, I'm a daughter of an African, okay? I grew up with my father. I grew up with my uncles. I grew up with my cousins in and out of my house. And I'm here to tell you, in the modern era, how a little bit in the beginning of a challenge it is for them to assimilate into this system. So am I to really believe someone directly came from Africa, couldn't speak English, came here in a chain, learned how to navigate the system, learned how to read and write, learned how to go to the court systems, and to eventually become a landowner? You have to understand that that is British common law. And these were men familiar with British common law because they were from England. I'm not saying they were not African genetically. I'm just giving the source. So a lot of times when we do these DNA tests and we see little traces of North African, I'm not talking about Chris's test now. Okay, I'm talking about conventional DNA tests where you see a little bit of 1% North African. You're seeing some people are actually getting matches to, what do they call it, West Asia. And I'm talking about Afro-Americans and Caribbean. They don't understand where that's coming from. Where that's coming from is a whole cleansing out. These people that came in were not pure. They may have been predominantly West African, but they had been there long enough that where they started mixing. And when you start talking about North Africans, you're talking about people who are mixed with what they call sub-Saharan African, which I don't believe in that term personally, because it's a mixture of Senegambian, Malian, and all those, Afro-Asiatic type groups and Chadic African groups mixed with a certain amount of West Asian elements and Southern European elements, and those people mix over time, and then they create what we call a genetic community, and those communities are Moroccan, and those are based on the miscegenated populations. Again, not dealing with the less miscegenated populations that are still there and indistinguishable genetically from the other Africans a little further south, like Malians and stuff like that. So we have to understand why we are seeing those types of markers. And this is why when I looked at your father's DNA, now bear in mind, you know your father's lineage, right? Yeah. I looked at your father's DNA and he had the same ancestral composition as a Tunisian who's not that miscegenated. I'm not talking about the miscegenated, one who's less admixed. He had the same mixture. Your father had the same genetic pattern as an Algerian who wasn't too miscegenated, and that Algerian signaled Fulani the same way your father signaled Wolof and Fulani. So we have to understand, at the end of the day, those are computer-generated algorithms. And I find it interesting that we have the same sort of genetic pattern. The Ghanaian, when we're talking about 23andMe, there's a more, I call it an Amizog pattern, because I have observed Amizog people to have it. They have the mixture of the Nigerian, the Senegambian, and the Ghanaian with a little bit of Bantu. And if they're not too miscegenated, they will even show little tiny Native American markers, okay? And that's a whole nother discussion. So they have a similar type of pattern to the people that came in we have a similar type of pattern to those people. So I'm not saying direct transport from Africa did not exist, but when you're talking about the Virgin Islands, which saw less than 1% directly transported Africans, when you're talking about Jamaica, which had less than 7.8% of directly transported Africans, and when you're talking about North American, Afro-American people, again, where you have numbers being quoted anywhere from 4 to 6%, that does not explain the amount of West African DNA that we have. Now, it's not like we don't have a basis of comparison, because when you look at some people that I've seen some results as a comparison who belong to the tribes, not all tribal members, but some of the people who belong to the Eastern Woodland tribes, they will have, if they didn't do too much intermixing, okay, intermix more with the white Europeans, you will see a higher Bantu content and less of that West African content, or if they don't come from enslaved lineages. I also noticed the Garifuna people, who are pre-Columbian, they have a very high Bantu content, a high Native American content, because they come out of St. Vincent's, and there was a colony of more Asian-derived populations. They also do not tend to get that breakdown that I call an Army-Zog pattern, because guess what? The Garifunas weren't enslaved. So if you start to recognize who was the ones being primarily enslaved, I didn't say exclusively, but primarily enslaved, then it would all make sense. And then this would explain cultural patterns, the food. This would explain why many of the Southerners, Afro-Americans, were playing Bridge in the South, which was a common card game that was being played during the reign of Queen Elizabeth I. This would explain the whole concept of jumping the broom, which was a European medieval custom. This would explain the Southern accent, which is a derivative of the English accent. This would explain a lot of things you do not generally find, except for certain select areas, maybe off of the coast of Georgia, or among some of the Gullah Geechee, or maybe certain areas that are very tiny, or in the Louisiana area. You generally will find that a great deal of the culture of the Afro-American people is actually stemming out of Europe. Even deep fried chicken is from Scotland. Just because we make it taste good does not mean it has its origins in Africa. And let me just say this on that note. I'm talking DNA. You have scholars like Professor Thomas Sowell, Sowell, who is actually from Northampton, North Carolina. He's a professor where he actually studied the subversive elements of Afro-American people down to our accents, black English, what they call Black English or Ebonics, down to our customs. And do you know, it was all traced to Scotland in the 1700s and England. So somebody has explaining.
Let me stop you right there. Let me stop you right there, because now you're going into something that I want you to speak on. And after you speak on that, I want to turn it over to Chris. I want you to talk about your study on the guy from, I think you said he was from Ireland. Let me mention this too. Before you do that. For you who may not know, there's a YouTube channel. If you type in Turtle Gang NYC, I think that's what it is. You can just Google Turtle Gang and look at his YouTube channel. Make sure you type in Olmecs, because that is another piece that's being used to mislead people and create division in the entire continent of the Americas, below the imaginary line that takes you into Mexico and above. It's a very divisive conversation, and people are not being honest about it, or it's just going over their heads and they can't comprehend it, or, they just don't like the information. The Olmecs, please check his channel out, because I learned a lot from this about the transformation anamorphism, I think that's what it is, from man to animal, from animal to man, showing that change in the features when you're changing into an animal, which would describe some of the features that you see on the Olmec heads. He's been there, you know, and talked with the people down there, talked with the, I think he spoke with archaeologists. I mean, all this stuff is on video. So it's on video. Can't make it up. Talking to these people, talking to the natives down there. Basically, let me just be straightforward. Those Olmec heads, based off of the information that I've seen, are not African heads from kings. Those are not African heads. Now, a lot of people don't like that. That's something that you have to make right in your own spirit or not. I've made peace with it, you know, because I'm all about truth seeking and being intellectually honest and accepting whatever it is. If it is what it is, and accept it. Now, has Africans mixed in with the people down there? Of course. Of course. We have a tribal citizen just told me yesterday that his wife took a DNA test, and I think she was 23% African, and she and her people came high in the mountains who actually escaped a lot of the brutality from the conquistadors, still showing that, you know, 23% African.
Well, see, for me,
and just like you said, over in the Polynesian Islands, those folks over there are showing that too. And I'm gonna let you come back, because you know, these folks just spread out everywhere and left a genetic footprint and populated the whole world, and then they started trading everywhere they went. But if you don't mind talking about your study of Ireland and what you were getting ready to say as well.
Well, I was getting ready to say, for me, I divide African DNA. I don't see African DNA as all the same, meaning that the Bantu DNA was global and ancient. It wasn't that I'm not here to debate the out of Africa theory. I know some people don't believe in it. I see that DNA along with pygmy DNA as being ancient, global, and primordial. Okay? Like I said, Mozambique DNA, as DNA consultants call it, was found in Tibet. It was found among the Navajo. That DNA simply was global. So I'm careful not to treat that as if somebody else was here and then Bantu people came in. That's not how I see it, because it's too primordial in people's DNA. If you understand what I'm saying, it's primordial in my husband's DNA, it's primordial with the Polynesians, it's primordial globally. It's this type of whole global thing. What I do see as new is when we get markers that are West African. Now, it very well could be pre-Columbian, but they are not ancient to America. No, those are visitors. That is how I divide it. So I don't use the term African in a very global sense. I don't see the similarity to Angola, Hadza people, and those people as a group of people who were just minding their business in Africa, and then you had a group of Asians all living in the Americas, and then they came and invaded them, because that's not what the timeline is showing for the Meso or Mexican people who have the Austronesian and the Bantu markers. Their timelines don't show that. The timeline shows that's the earlier part of their DNA, and the Native American is what's coming later. Now, that's not my theory. That's what I look at. That's what I see. You understand, when you actually track it. So
absolutely,
that's why I'm making the delineation. You understand? So when someone says, well, you know, I have African DNA, I'm a little, you know, how are they looking at that? Because if it's primarily Cameroon Congo, which is the reference Bantu reference that's used with ancestry DNA, you know, you will see people in Mexico with the large, you know, not large, but relatively decent amount of Cameroon Congo out the Yucatan area. I've seen it that DNA, if you look at it from a sequencing perspective, is earlier on ancestry. So that is not to be treated, that is not in my opinion, based on what I've seen. That is not to be treated as if some, they came in. Because what I see, it's not what I want to believe. That's what I see because I look at sequencing. What is not ancient to the land is the Senegambian, the Ghanaian, the Nigerian. No. It could have come in before the slave trade. It could have come in with the slave trade. And then again, it gets a little sketchy because when we talk about slave trade, we're talking about slave trading. It wasn't exactly all out of Africa. Because before we get to Ireland, let me say this, because I'm going to go straight into what you want me to. If you ever look at St. Kittians, they are very dark-skinned, African-looking people, okay? If you've been to the Caribbean, the Caribbean in general is a very melanated place, okay? Barbados, you see all these Afro faces. St. Kitts, Afro faces. Did you ever wonder how is it that you can have these islands that literally have African faces with varying complexions due to mixtures, but their accents are European? You cannot use the argument that, well, their overseers were Europeans, so therefore that's how they speak, because that's not what influences accent. Accent is influenced by the people that are most around you, not by who's overseeing you from a distance. You understand? Mm-hmm. So if you study the Bayesian accent is Irish. How so? Do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes, I'm following.
How can you be people that have faces that resemble more the people of Africa and your accent is Irish? Where's your African accents? Where are your African loan words? Look at the dishes that they're eating. Souse, tripe, carnival. All of these things are from Europe. Again, I'm not saying the African slave trade did not exist. I'm saying that that's the only narrative that they're telling, but they're not really telling you the main source for the people that came into those places. Because think about it. They were enslaved, and what was their industry? Sugarcane, right? Sugarcane, the whole process of the refinery of that is a skill. That was known in Europe. So I'm dealing with other things, but let's just deal with the DNA. So Montserrat is my go-to standard because why? It's a small island. By the late 1600s, almost 70% of their servants, slaves, were Irish, okay? And yet, when you look at that island, everybody is brown to dark skin, okay? The other thing, too, if you go to slavevoyage.org and look at the actual importation, okay, you will see that you will see no more than 10 ships that literally came from the African continent, and they came more or less from the area of Gambia, what we call Gambia today, okay? So, what you notice with the people from Montserrat, okay, so I've established that the slave trade cannot explain Montserrat people. So let's talk about the Montserrat people. We know that their slave rebellion happened on St. Patrick's Day. We know that their national dish is goat water, which is a rendition of goat stew, which is Irish goat stew, called, I forgot what it's called, but it's a rendition of the Irish goat stew. we know that there's St. Patrick's celebration is actually larger than Ireland. And when you speak to people from St. Kitts, I'm sorry, Montserrat. I keep saying St. Kitts, but Montserrat. But this applies to St. Kitts as well. I'm talking about Montserrat people. When you speak to them, they all have oral history of ancestors coming out of Ireland. But just like anybody else, they're constantly told Africa, Africa, Africa. But what they have is the history coming out of Ireland. Now, what I've noticed, and I started becoming suspicious of it, I started noticing that a lot of people in the Caribbean and also quite a few of us from the southeast part of the United States, we were getting this Igbo matching. Igbo. Now, it's just instinctual to just think about, well, that's because they took them from Igbo land, okay? But that does not apply to the people from Montserrat. And I pretty much predicted that if I can get a hold of a Montserrat person's DNA, a full Montserrat, that I would be able to prove that Igbo DNA also comes out of Ireland. And I was. And he fit the prediction. And that's exactly what I've been able to see. That Igbo you see throughout Barbados, where you had a large amount of Irish people that came there. Now, don't get me wrong. You had the fair ones that also came there. But you also had a lot of the Afro descendants. And there were people of African descent living in Ireland. This is not spoken of. It's dismissed, but it is absolutely true. You do not find, and I have Montserrat people in my practice, born and raised. I have a lot of Caribbean people. I ask them, can you please tell me any relic of African culture, any loan words? And do you know the most that any of them can tell me? It's carnival. And carnival does not come out of Africa. There's no loan words. There's nothing in their tradition. But what they do have is a predominant Benin Togo type of pattern that you see on Ancestry DNA, and they get the Igbo matching. And I've seen it on a number of people when they take Chris's test as well. They get a little bit of Igbo matching, or they get Igbo matching. And I can't prove that some of it is not coming directly out of Africa, but it's not lining up for Montserrat people. That's not Montserrat's narrative. So that can't be used. You understand? So I extrapolated that, and that's consistent with the other findings and the other things I talked about. Now, my Montserrat sample that I have, one of the things that he does not have is the Romani Gypsy DNA that Chris Lusakis actually, he opened my eyes more to that DNA because a lot of us get that DNA. But I noticed that the Montserrat and also his relatives that I get to see, they don't get that. And when you think about who was in England, even though the Romani Gypsies were all over Europe, apparently it wasn't a big presence of them in Ireland. The other thing that I noticed with his DNA, I tracked it and I traced it. He had a lot of ancient matches to Russia. Okay? And I noticed that with a close friend of mine who's from Guyana, who has roots out of Barbados. And I wondered, where are these deep matches from Russia coming from? And she's 100% African on DNA tests. I'm talking about the deep root matches that show up. Where is this coming from? And then I did some reading on Ireland that a great deal of their population migrated, where you had migrations coming out of the Central Asian steppes, which is present-day Russia, and they migrated into Ireland. So he shows those mixtures. So I say all of that to say that that's an untold story, and it's a huge story. It's a huge story, and this is not told. I'm not the only one. There are people who studied this in detail. You have, I think her name is Dr. Marie, I forget her name. She's in England. She literally is a historian, and she has a PhD. She's studied this whole cleansing out of Europe because you have people that had lands, so they're not going to acknowledge that. And of course, I speak to people who do genealogy, who do this for a living, and they tell me how they will see someone with their last name that is different from the owners, and they would just have the birthplace Africa. We know that a lot of what came out of Europe also stopped off in Africa, and before they brought them to the Caribbean, and they would put that as the source. So it's not easy to prove if you're talking about records, but in terms of the sequencing, and when you're talking about a small island like Montserrat, where they are their lineage directly out of the African continent in terms of slave transport hardly exists. No, something else has to explain what we're looking at, and also strong oral history of Irish heritage. Something has to
Dr.
explain.
Fatu,
Yeah.
there's two professors. One is deceased, one is still living, and they would agree with your analysis because they've said the same thing. One is Dr. Jack Forbes. For whoever don't know him, he's Algonquin out of Virginia, who was an authority, especially in Eastern Woodland history. And he spoke about the relationship between the Americas and Europe, and that relationship between the people here and the people there. You're just going into more detail about that relationship. And Dr. Arwen Smallwood, who's still living, he's a scholar, a professor at A&T University in North Carolina. He's Tuscarora, and he speaks about all of this. And he speaks about the Africans who were marooned in northeastern North Carolina and took indigenous wives. I mean, you're on point with everything that you're saying. So I just want to let you know, you're mentioning scholars. I've mentioned a couple, and you have to be honest with yourself and just accept what it is. Nobody's making this up. We're not creating narratives, not trying to create stories, because why would we want to create a false story instead of accepting who you are and honoring your ancestors from the four directions, wherever they came from? It's no need. It's no need to make anything up. But anyway, I want to introduce, and thank you, Dr. Fatu. Thank you for that wonderful presentation. There's going to be, later on, you may have some people asking you some questions. But meanwhile, right now, I want to bring Chris on so he can introduce himself and talk about what he do.
Thank you, Lavelle. I really appreciate it. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here. And Dr. Fatu, that's a wonderful presentation on some of the research you've done. And it really causes me to pause for a moment and just the depth at some of the points you were making, and some of the observations I've made just absolutely parallel what you're talking about. Recently, again, my name is Chris Lasakis. I'm the owner operator of Native DNA. That's native-dna.com. And I've been doing that for about the last 11 years. It'll be 12 years coming up in the fall, in September. I started in my business in September of 2012. And it's been a wonderful experience to learn and be able to work with the customers. And I tell you what, I learn as much from them as they do from me, and just all the stories, the hundreds and hundreds of stories and testimonies and just different things that I've gotten to hear have just been a really, really fun, enjoyable thing to be able to do as an occupation. Some of the research I'm working in currently, I'm working with Chickasaw DNA and researching the interactions of the Chickasaw people. The Chickasaw people, sure, pretty much everybody here knows, originated, in northern Mississippi, western Tennessee, southwest Kentucky, and perhaps the very southern tip of Illinois, up there in the Metropolis, Illinois area, just to the west of Paducah, Kentucky. But just some of the genetic signals dealing with the Chickasaw people and how they interacted with the Comanche and even the tribes of the Carolinas, the Occaneechi-Saponi, the Cherokee, and further north, even some more of the Siouan-speaking tribes, and as well as into South Carolina. The Chickasaw had really a wide breadth of interactions. They were excellent traders. They were very diplomatic. They participated in a lot of the diplomatic interactions and things that really went a long way, even dealing with the U.S. government and things like that. A lot of them were entrepreneurs, and I've also been studying Comanche DNA recently. And the Comanche, as many of you know, were they were a very protective tribe of their territory, that ran from Kansas south through Oklahoma, the very eastern portion of Colorado, and down into eastern New Mexico. But mostly they were centered around Texas and Oklahoma. And they interacted very heavily also with the Native Americans down into northern and central Mexico. So those are just a couple of the research points I've been focusing on over the last 5 to 6 months that I've really found interesting, and uncovering new things all the time, and just really enjoying it. So that's been fun.
Awesome. Well, one of the unique things about your DNA test is you actually, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, you test east of the Mississippi and you do not base everything off of Plains DNA. Is that right?
That's correct. Absolutely. Yeah. The STR marker system that I work with, and that, the analysis we kind of built from the ground up really does exactly that. It doesn't, like with the original 23andMe analysis, it doesn't root everything in Pima DNA. Of course, the Pima, were nearly 100% Native American, and those original S&P tests, like you mentioned, Lavelle, anchored pretty much everything around Pima and Maya. And we've been able to, through some of the more recent studies, a couple of them from UC Davis back in 2016 and 17, and several others, have been able to gather samples from Cherokee people, Creeks, both out of Georgia and South Alabama, as well as Lumbees. Now, the Lumbee sample, I think that goes back to about 2008 when that was gathered. But yes, like you're saying, other tribes aside from the southwestern U.S. or northern central Mexico. That's right.
What did you find within the Lumbee DNA testing?
Oh, that is fascinating.
What stood out to you on that? Okay.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just wondering what stood out to you. What was unique about the Lumbee DNA testing? What was your findings?
That is a fascinating discussion. It is very deep. There's so much going on there, and some of the things using the populations that we have, specifically, some of the S&P data is revealing too. But to me, the STR analysis with that particular tribe, the Lumbee people, the number one population that I see there is with Ontario Algonquins. So the Ojibwe people of Ontario, Canada, as well as the Algonquins extending down into Michigan, and a little further west. Sometimes I'll see Minnesota pop up in there too, the Algonquin people, the Ojibwe specifically. And then the second highest tribe or population that I see associated with Lumbee would be Creek, Choctaw. Many times will appear there as well. I see Chickasaw sometimes. Really, I'll use my wife's family as an example. My wife has Chickasaw ancestry through her mother's family. And when she took, some of you may know, be familiar with the DNA tribes test that is defunct. It's they discontinued their analysis back in, I think, 2018. Anyhow, Lucas Martin, the owner of DNA Tribes, kind of mentored me for a while. He was a a friend of mine and kind of helped get me up to speed on, what to look for and what signals represent what populations. Anyway, long story short, when my wife's mother took the DNA test, again, she's part Chickasaw, Lumbee came up as the proxy for the Chickasaw ancestry. So the Lumbee people absolutely do have a Muskogean component as well, Choctaw Creek, Chickasaw. And then below that, I'll see Romani ancestry. So, Turkey appears sometimes Armenia. However, the Turkish component seems to be stronger. And of course, obviously, a significant component as well from the Yoruba people of Nigeria and further west. And also a lot of times Senegambia pops up in there as well as a significant contribution to the Lumbees, and Melungeon as well. You'll see the Melungeon population there. So fascinating.
Oh yeah. In our area, which I'm about 30 minutes away from the Lumbees,
Mm-hmm.
and there was a lot of mixing in our area. I am about 35 minutes away from Chief Hatcher, who's chief of the Waccamaw Indians of South Carolina.
Okay.
He's in the northern part of the state that borders North Carolina. He's in Horry County,
Mm-hmm.
in that area. And what we find, the Chickasaw were in northern South Carolina because there's a record showing them in Four Holes, South Carolina. I think they were being charged for some type of murder. I forget all the details on it, but they are definitely documented in being in that area. And
Wow.
and based on DNA, they do show up in a lot of people around here. And we have a very close relationship with Algonquins, in our state, the North Carolina Algonquins, their family actually.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of them were absorbed or amalgamated into the Tuscarora,
Yes.
and identify as Tuscarora today. I have cousins who are Machapunga, who are Algonquin, and a lot of professors really get confused when they study the Cape Fear region. They're trying to make out, are we Algonquin? Are we Siouan? And then they completely omit Iroquois.
Wow.
Which, see, when I met with a professor at UNC Wilmington 3 times, I think, and I decided not to talk to him. It was just a waste of time because
Mm-hmm.
he's already written books and already been on PBS and all these different shows.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think he's up for retracting any information that the communities are correcting him on, because when it comes to Tuscarora, the history is intact. The
Mm-hmm.
language is intact. There's fluent Tuscarora speakers that exist. The history has not been lost. So when we talk to these folks in the institutions of higher learning about oral history, they don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
The only thing they really want to base their information off of is John Lawson, who was the Surveyor General. His job was to survey the land for the Lord's proprietors, to divide the land for Europeans. That was his job.
Mm-hmm.
So during his job, he would talk to the tribes, try to learn bits and pieces of the languages. That's why he recorded Wokan language. He recorded certain words in Tuscarora. He did certain tribes. He will record the language. Well, he's regarded today as almost like the Bible, ultimate truth. He cannot go wrong. Everything he says is the truth. Everybody else is a lie. Well, what's coming from our people, from the community, our cousins are Algonquin. Basically, we live on Ocean Highway, basically the coast.
Mm-hmm.
We live on the coast. You had Algonquin people and Siouan people and Iroquois people and Muskogee people all mixing and trading and intermarrying from northern North Carolina, northern part of South Carolina, all up to Southern Virginia.
Yes.
mixing and marrying. So it becomes problematic when people try to put us in a box and try to call us one thing instead of asking us, who are you?
That's
What
right.
do you call yourself? Are you Algonquin? Are you Siouan? Well, we spoke more than one language because if you lived on the border, watch South Carolina and North Carolina. South Carolina was a lot of Muskogee folks, right?
Yes.
So if you live on the border, of course you're going to be speaking the language of the people who live, the majority of the people there.
That's good.
And you're probably, if you're living closer to them, you're probably going to have more of a relationship with them. Same as if you're living closer to Algonquin people, you're probably going to have more of a relationship with them and speaking the language there. So, you know, all these little nuances, it's not taken into account. So, yeah, we really appreciate it. And your DNA is just pulling it all out and showing it. You're showing the Algonquin, the Muskogean, and you're showing all of this.
Yes.
So our oral history is actually coming alive through your DNA test. Basically, is what I'm saying.
Yes, absolutely. I see it all the time. It's amazing to see. It really is.
How would you, what would you say to the people who's going to be listening to this to encourage them to not be afraid of DNA tests? Because a lot of people are afraid of DNA tests. They're afraid that the government is going to take their DNA and use it for nefarious reasons. And I can't blame people for thinking that way because the government has done some very bad things. You know, in regards to creating diseases, Tuskegee experiment, and so on. So how would you encourage people to explore DNA?
I think, and I absolutely, Lavelle, I totally agree. I think, and I mean, I've even had some in my family who have been very leery, especially recently with some of the 23andMe break-in, you know, hack and all that stuff that's happened. But I think the thing that I would like to encourage people in is that not only are not all DNA testing companies, not all DNA tests created equal, but for me, the big thing that I like to tell folks is I don't keep any sort of, with my business specifically, I don't keep any sort, and there's other companies that do this too. I'm not the only one. I'll just say that. Want to be totally transparent. Not all DNA testing companies keep records online. And so with some of these smaller DNA testing companies like myself, DNA Consultants is another one. We keep only only in-house databases on, like, you know, external hard drives, et cetera, you know, so on and so forth, so that information cannot be hacked. You know, I can only officially speak for myself and my company, but I don't keep any kind of records whatsoever, even backups online. Everything is kept in-house. And so there's no way for any information to be hacked. And the lab that I use too, DDC, that's DNA Diagnostics in Fairfield, Ohio. It's a suburb of Cincinnati. They don't keep, I think they might keep your sample for about a month just to make sure if there's any mix-ups. If a customer contacts me and says, I think there may have been a mix-up at the lab, I can then reach out to them, and DDC will keep your sample for about only a month, just so that we can call on those samples to rerun them if we need to double check. But they don't keep them long. They don't keep an in-house record either. So I think that's one of the biggest differences between some of the smaller companies like myself and the larger big box consumer DNA companies.
Yeah, they really make it hard for the smaller companies. So, you know, my hat's off to you with everything that you're doing, because some of these larger companies, they're very, I don't trust them. You know, the larger companies, working with law enforcement, working with different medical companies, and is it, you know, what they're presenting to you, is it accurate? And when I say that, the first person comes to mind is Rick Kittles from African DNA. What's his name? Professor Gates. Professor Gates.
Right.
He spoke about Oprah calling herself a Zulu. So he calls Rick Kittles. He calls Rick Kittles up, and that conversation is, Rick, did you tell Oprah she's a Zulu? Rick says no. And he says, well, she's saying she's a Zulu. Said, why don't you go ahead and just make her a Zulu because you're making that stuff up anyway.
Wow.
And then Rick Kittles was questioned, and it's just, around that particular DNA company, there's just he needs to come public and do some cleanup, because it looks like there's some things that's just dishonest going on in there.
Wow.
If you want to buy a tribe, you probably can.
Yeah. Yeah.
So thank you for what you're doing, and
You're very welcome.
With Dr. Fatou speaking for you, and just stay on the straight and narrow. Keep doing what you're doing.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Before I let folks in to ask questions, I want to ask both of you, is there anything else that you would like to say before we turn it over for questions and answers?
I can't think of anything right off the top of my head. In 30 seconds, I might, but so.
Okay. How about you, Dr. Fatou?
I'm sorry, I got distracted by a patient. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That's okay. That's okay. Well, I'm getting ready to turn it over to the listeners for questions and answers. But before I do that, I wanted to see if it was anything else you wanted to say before you get bombarded with questions.
Oh, okay. I encourage people that do the DNA test. It has really, what we're able to test for is amazing. It allows you to really go back. It helps you with your genealogy, and it gives you a sense of completion, because to me, it's all about learning all your ancestry, not picking different parts of it. You understand? It's about embracing all aspects of yourself. And I am really so happy with Native DNA. Chris has really helped a whole lot of us. I haven't met one dissatisfied customer. We're so happy, and you end up learning history, and I'm into that. You end up learning history. You end up learning how the tribes interacted with each other, how it all converged. I mean, I didn't even know about the relationship between the indigenous people here in America and the Basque people of Europe, and until I read about it, and then I asked him, hey, what's up with all of us getting these tiny matches to the Basque people? And then I did some reading. Pardon me.
Well, also, Chris,
yes, sir.
One more thing before I turn it over.
Sure.
Would you like to speak a little bit about the DNA of the Polynesian area?
Sure, I'd be glad to. That's something that is a long story in my family. There is in Hawaii, for those of you who know much about it, it's a multicultural, multi-ethnic hub. And when I was 5, me and my family went there. I remember the trip pretty well, but that's going back a ways. One of the biggest things that I'll say is that in my family in particular, the Native Hawaiian ancestry was hidden from us, because there's a certain stigma in Hawaii about between some of the higher class and the Native Hawaiian people. And the Native Hawaiians a lot of times they're not viewed the same. And there's discrimination there. And to make a long story short, the Native Hawaiian ancestry in my family was hidden for quite a long time. And my dad, before he passed in 2021, told me a couple of times that his mother told him 3 or 4 different times on 3 or 4 different occasions that, Robert, I'm part Native Hawaiian, and that he and a couple other of the siblings were the only ones that she would share that information with. And of course, he passed that information down to me over the years before he passed. And About 2008, I started getting into the DNA testing world and started learning which tests are good and so on and so forth. Of course, at that time, there's only 3 or 4 different ones to choose from, a lot different than today. Um, and we took the S&P test, and it did show not as much as I was expecting. It was like 4 or 5% Native Hawaiian or Polynesian, but the sub-Saharan African component was particularly fascinating to me, and he was coming back somewhere between 2 and 3% sub-Saharan African. And so what I did was I did a little inference, and I thought, well, I think the sub-Saharan African behalf here, the portion is telling us there's more Polynesian than what the Polynesian portion of your results are saying. The admixture wasn't adding up. And so with time, though, those results have gotten a lot better. And with some of the new G25 data that you can get, it's simulated data for S&P analyses, the Polynesian percentage has gone up to more like between 15 and 18%, which is much more accurate and about what my grandmother was conveying to my father that she was about 30-35%. So anyway, the Polynesian ancestry as a whole in general overall is about 20 to 25% sub-Saharan African. And like Dr. Fatou said, a lot of that goes back to the African Great Lakes region and further west into the Benin, Togo, Ghana, or excuse me, really from Nigeria west through the Benin area and all that in through there, the Bantu seabed region. And then also from African Great Lakes. So about 20-25%. That would be slightly higher, probably on the 25% end, down towards Samoa, Tahiti, as far east as Tahiti, then back west through Micronesia or Melanesia, excuse me. And then a little less, probably on the 20% end for the Marquesas Islands and Hawaii. And then the other portion of the Polynesian genome would consist of about 45 to 60% East Asian, anywhere in there, that range. And then the rest would be European Spanish, with some Scottish in there as well, but mostly European Spanish because of the exploration all throughout that region of the Spanish expeditions. And then also some from obviously Captain Cook and his men, they went through there as well. So Western Europe in general. And then there's also some small amounts of Native American ancestry that can be found throughout Polynesia. That typically gets no higher than 10 or 15%. But there is quite a bit of evidence of Salish, Tlingit, Haida, and even, which is all far northwestern Pacific coast Native Americans. And then also some that can appear from like Southern California, the Serrano people, the Cochimi from northern Baja, Mexico. And so it's definitely a composite population. The Polynesian people as a whole are a composite population. So really fascinating stuff.
It really shows how people they traveled, they met other people, and they mixed.
Yes,
mixed
totally.
with each other. Polynesians were here. East Indians were here.
Mm-hmm.
Chinese were here. Europeans, Africans, everybody came here and left DNA. You know, they were just trading DNA.
That's right.
I'm sure if someone from Ireland comes here and sees this pretty Indian girl, boy, you look beautiful, and they hook up and have a baby. I mean, it was told, I heard a minister say this: a natural man loves a natural woman. Doesn't care what race or how her complexion. Mm-hmm. Men love women, women love men. So, you know, mixing is a natural thing, as we see happening today. This is nothing new under the sun. People mix today just like they did back then. They mix back then just like they're doing today. No different.
That's right.
But anyway, thank you for that, Chris. I'm going to open it up for anyone who has questions. Everyone try to be respectful and not talk over each other, but the floor is open for questions.
I'll kick things off. Just a couple questions. Thank both of you again, Chris and Dr. Fatu. Really quick, Chris, if you could drop your company name so that everyone would have that to go and check out and keep you in mind for that testing.
Absolutely. Sure, Tanea, no problem. My company is Native DNA, and you can reach me at native-dna.com. And there's a form you can fill out there to either contact me, or my direct email for my company is nativednatesting@gmail.com.
Okay, fantastic. So the questions are, and we have another question from one of our tribal members, Tracy, but I had a question first, and both of you can give feedback on this. You have the DNA testing, and I've heard of something called GEDmatch, and Dr. Fatu, you've given some guidance in how this works, but I'm still a little unsure about it. If both of you could give us some feedback on what the differences are between the DNA testing and GEDmatch, and then also the benefits or setbacks, if there are any of those.
Well, GEDmatch basically is a different set of oracles that are created by different geneticists, and they create different oracles, and you download your raw data and you upload it into these programs. Basically, Ancestry DNA, 23andMe, MyHeritage, those are all computer-based genetic programs, okay, that analyze your DNA, and they have a reference panel of different populations that they're comparing your DNA to. I'm perhaps oversimplifying it, but what happens with GEDmatch, you basically have different DNA tests created by different geneticists, and now you have the raw data and you're able to upload it. So you get to see different populations, because some oracles are more specialized for, let's say, European ancestry. You have some oracles that are more specialized for South Asian ancestry. You have some oracles that are more specialized for the Native American ancestry. You know, you have different oracles that look at more ancient populations. They compare your DNA against the DNA of ancient populations like the Natufians of the Levant area. So the advantage is that when you play with those different oracles, you get to see the matches to your DNA. You get to see how you match the patterns, and over time you get to see, especially when you start looking at family members and people who come from the similar background, you start to see how you have similarities on the ancient population mixing, and of course you're going to have individual family differences. But all it is basically, Ancestry is one type of genetic test. To simplify the answer, Ancestry is one type of genetic test, 23 is another genetic test, and all of these are just individual genetic tests. GEDmatch allows you to look at your DNA through multiple DNA tests, which is really cool, because, you know, each DNA test has different references, so you get to see different things. You understand? So I don't know if I'm answering your question. I don't see any downside to it. I actually think it's a great thing.
Thank you, Dr. Fatu.
Yeah, when you download your raw data from 23andMe or from Ancestry, and you create a GEDmatch account and you upload it into GEDmatch, when you're on Ancestry, you're going to get a lot of hits connecting you to cousins, connecting you to relatives. Same with 23andMe. So when you go to GEDmatch, you're going to get people who have tested in 23andMe and people who tested in Ancestry, and I think maybe Family Tree, I'm not sure. So you're going to get more hits on GEDmatch, because if you're just in Ancestry, you're just going to get Ancestry. But if you're in GEDmatch, you're going to get everybody who uploaded their raw data to GEDmatch. And if they match you, then it's going to ping, and you're going to get connected to those people. So I've had people who are not on Ancestry who, they're with 23andMe or a different company, and contacted me as showing a relationship, a kinship to me. So yeah, it's definitely GEDmatch is good, and we have a lot of relatives who are damn near experts in GEDmatch. I'm not an expert in GEDmatch. I understand it a little bit, but reading the graphs and everything, I'm not there. I'm not there yet. So, but yeah, it's a good company, basically.
Excuse me, Chief. This is Tracy. I've actually used the GEDmatch, the 23andMe, the Ancestry, the MyHeritage, and the Native DNA Ancestry. And I can say that the Native DNA Ancestry actually showed a lot of what I'd been told through my family history. It even showed where one of my relatives, which was my great grandmother, was from Madagascar. We'd always heard that through one of my great uncles, but it actually showed Madagascar actually showed up in this particular one in the Native American DNA, as well as my Native American heritage.
Wow. That's terrific. Thank you for sharing that, Tracy.
Thank you.
Awesome.
I have the feather.
Appreciate you sharing that, Tracy, and being honest about it. Did somebody else say something? We have another question.
Feather, Chief.
Yes, sir. Go for it, man.
Yes, I just want to thank both of you, the doctor and the other gentleman, for being able to delve into, our DNA in such a way. Everything that the doctor was saying and the other gentleman, I have actually seen all of those markers, the Igbo, the Irish. My Irish line goes back to King O'Neill out of Ireland. I also have found the Asian part, and I didn't know where that could have came from because I come from Eastern North Carolina. I have the Saponi and the Scuderi bloodline, but some of it goes into the Lumbee and also the Melungeon side. And I just want to thank you guys because you're making us be able to see why it makes sense. All these different bloodlines and the African, like I said, that's coming in there as well. So I just want to thank you guys being able to, give us the information in this way. So thank you.
You're very welcome.
Thank you, cousin, for your question. Any more questions? The floor is open. We have some experts on here for you. Ask your questions. I'm hearing crickets.
Well, let me say this.
All right.
Prince Lusakis confirmed my suspicions because I was noticing I have access to my uncle's, my mom's brother's DNA, her full brother, and of course my mother's DNA on Ancestry. And I was noticing some matches to people coming out of the Maryland area. And every time I would click on one, a whole bunch of people, the Proctors, the Savoys, I click on the Savoy, the Proctors, the Thompson, the Butlers, and the Savoys would pop up, and then you click on the Thompsons. And I couldn't figure this out. And I started reading that the Piscataway people out of Maryland, they tend to have those surnames. So I pretty much was putting it together that one of my ancestors came out of that region. And then when I uploaded my mom's raw data, because he does the SNP test, she's no longer with us, so I can't do the STR, but the SNP test is really good, especially, considering, right? And I uploaded my uncle's SNP test. He got the Delaware Lenape. And he was, a little surprised by the Delaware Lenape. And I explained to him that it's consistent with my recent Piscataway findings because the Delaware Lenape and the Piscataway intermingled a lot. They're adjacent. And that's why he was able to pick that up. So his company is excellent.
Awesome. Quick question is, taking a chance, is Turtle Gang on the call?
Greetings, brother.
I would love for him to give a greetings, Turtle. Could you?
Greetings, Dr. Fatou.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. It's a wonderful presentation by both you, Chris as well.
Thank you.
Incredible. I'm very interested. Now, Dr. Fatou, you know I got that Cameroon and I got that Southeast Asian. So I definitely would like to speak with you on just, trying to gain a better understanding. Because, I mean, you laid a lot of things out that kind of shed a lot of light on suspicions and hunches that I had for many years. So, I don't want to monopolize the show tonight, but I definitely would like to learn a little bit more about that. And I took my DNA, obviously, and I wanted to also make a mention too, in terms of our African DNA genetics coming through our European ancestors. Yeah, I have Black Dutch ancestors, and also Irish as well. So, and what we have seen through matching our genealogy to our to the DNA findings is that we received a lot of our what would be, or up until what I hear tonight, but we received a lot of our European ancestry through our Indian ancestors.
Yeah.
Can you speak on that just to for anybody who just to clarify on that, because I know you spoke about it earlier, but you could just speak a little bit about that, the European connection in terms of pre-Columbus. Or pardon me, not pre-Columbus. I mean, in terms of us having some of the genetics and African DNA through our European ancestors.
Oh, absolutely, because there was a lot of the people. Well, first let's talk about during the Inquisition. You had a whole movement of Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula that went into England, and that would explain the Chavezes and the Perrys, who were the Pereiras, and the D's, who was originally the Diaz. Those are anglicized versions of those names. And a lot of surnames that are quite common among us actually had roots out of those people that came out of England. And also for people that come out of, you will find, now that's the earlier part, you will find that the indentured servants that came into the colonies initially were more the Iberian Moorish type. They didn't directly come from the Iberian Peninsula. They came out of England, but they had roots out of the Iberian Peninsula, and there was a large amount of them living in England. So they were already quite familiar with British common law, and this is why they were comfortable owning land and going to court, even in the 1600s when you read Paul Heinig's references. What happened later was and by the way, those Moors that came in as indentured servants, and they often will tell you they came out of Angola, but there's no evidence of that. They were Senegambian predominant, okay? And they would have the Amizigh pattern, and these are the guys that were the Iberian Moor descendants. As you go on, and you now had the cleansing out of Scotland and Ireland, the DNA takes more of a Nigerian, Ghanaian pattern. So this is where you see the higher Nigerian content. This is why many of the people out of the Caribbean, although you have, again, the pre-Columbian aspect of Nigerian DNA that was already there, you had a large influx of the cleansing out of the Black Scots and the Black Irish, and they are Nigerian DNA predominant. So when you look at...
Can I just real quick interrupt? So the two largest DNA groups I have in terms of West Africa is Cameroon and Nigerian. So what you're saying is speaking directly to that.
Yes. But see, you would have I'm not surprised that you would have a large amount of Cameroon because you're, look, nobody's pure, but you're also coming out of what seems to be strong indigenous lines to this land, and they were Bantu predominant. They were not exclusively Bantu, but because there was always mixing going on. You had Malians coming here, and of course you had trading, but they were Bantu predominant. So the fact that that is your primary DNA marker is no surprise at all. As
Well,
opposed
it's like
to
18%. It's like
yeah,
18.
18 from ancestry is moving towards the higher side. I believe
Okay.
Lavelle, your parents were like in the 20s. Okay, so I tend to notice that people who kind of kept it native, who kept it native, who didn't do too much mixing. Of course, there's mixing, but they kind of mixed among themselves. They tend to have those higher Cameroon Congo in ancestry. They use Cameroon Congo and Angola Congo. They use with 23andMe. They tend to have that preserved, just like the Garifuna people. Well, if you look at their ancestries, they have very high 30% Cameroon Congo. Again, these are communities that were tended to be endogamous, and they were pre-Columbian. So that's what it speaks to.
Thank you very much. I definitely appreciate. I definitely want to have more of a conversation with you at another time. But I definitely appreciate you. And Chris, I absolutely am going to look into your company, and definitely like to submit, do my DNA through your company as well to learn more.
Awesome. Thank you.
And Turtle, I'll get with you too, man, about coming on the show so we can talk a little bit about the Olmecs and try to bring some balance to this ignorant this stuff that's going on across the country. I'm all about balance, and I'm all about people, accepting who they are, getting along, and coming together on commonality instead of looking at the differences. Yeah, we all have some differences, but we have a lot in common as well. And it does nobody any good to try to cherry pick things and just not accept the truth for what it is. So, and I like your documentaries. So I definitely want to have you on too.
Absolutely. And the truth, like the information I brought forth about the Olmec, that really is a unifying it's a unifying concept that you'll find all over the globe in indigenous cultures. So it's really speaking more to indigenous cultures than to just any one indigenous people. You know what I mean? It's kind of the universal root that you'll find all over the planet, and that's animism. So yeah, it's it's actually it's one of those things that it's like we have more in common than we have differences. So I think once people kind of embrace the truth of that, they'll see that in it as opposed to that's not us. You know what I mean? It is us in a grander idea. You know what I'm saying? So
how do you say the real people, principal people, or first people in your language in Lenape?
So the term Lenape is Muncie is our particular dialect. So the term Lenape or Lenape or Lenape Wak is referencing to man, human, person. Lenny, which is the prefix, is real. So, you know what I mean? So we would consider, like those of us who are Lenape, like from like the actual communities, we would consider ourselves Lenny Lenape, and any other person, regardless of who they are, we would call Lenape in the old times. You know what I'm saying? Not now, of course, but because Lenape is just a term that just means the people. People. You know what I mean? So principal people for us would be Lenny Lenape.
Okay, awesome. Because the reason why I ask you that is because we've always we always used our own language to describe ourselves, and not the colonial terms that's dominating the airways today. And real people have a deep respect for indigenous people globally. That
Yes.
means you respect indigenous Africans, indigenous Europeans, indigenous Asians, and you respect indigenous Americans. Um, Regardless of the differences, you have that deep respect of indigenous people worldwide. Now we have four directions that has morphed into what we have as the four colors, you know, in those four directions: the black, white, red, and yellow. The black of that, each one of those was given a responsibility. The black was given responsibility of water. The yellow was given a responsibility of air. The white was given a responsibility of fire, and the red was given the responsibility of land. And if you look at the world today, you see these particular responsibilities out of order. When you look at Africa, you know, they speak about water problems all the time. When you look at Asia, they talk about air pollution. They talk about air problems. When you look at the white part, the responsibility of fire, well, they took that fire and created the atom bomb. So now it became, instead of using it as a creative force, it became a destructive force. And then over here, you know, all of these populations have settled here and won't allow us to be the caretakers of the land like we're supposed to be. So that's out of order. You know, so basically everyone was given a responsibility. Traditional people realize that and they respect that. And when they connect with each other, they build on that instead of finding a way to become divisive. So yeah, I appreciate that, Turtle, and I appreciate everybody's input. So any other questions, anyone, before we conclude?
Yes, Chief. I would like to ask Dr. Fatu a question.
Yes.
In doing my genealogy, I've come across two confirmed African ancestors. One of them, in doing the history or in doing the research, one of them is said to have purchased his own passage to America on a Portuguese merchant ship. And the documents show that when he got to America, he purchased 200 acres of land. The other was brought over on a slave ship. And when he was taken to auction, he was set free because he had the markings of royalty. Have you heard anything like this in your research?
I've just reading about people's lineages. To me, just based on what I know, I don't question the origin of the one that had the markings.
Okay.
I question whether that the other one who you're calling African, the one that purchased. I see all of that denotes to me that's a person who's coming from an area where that's part of the culture, the whole concept of purchasing.
His name was Oyo Demery.
Yeah, that's an Afro-European. See, a lot of us are calling those men African. Yeah, they're African genetically, primarily. Those are Afro-Europeans. Anytime I read about anyone that went to court, purchased land, that's an Afro-European. There's no way. Like I said, I grew up with African relatives. There's no way, I have to take them here, take them there, got to teach them. And this is in the modern era, okay, where they already understood English from basic schooling coming here. If you understood the process behind that and the awkwardness in the modern era, then you would see how unrealistic that is to literally take someone we're talking about before the modern era out of a village of Africa. They can't speak English. They don't have this whole concept of purchasing in the way we do. That's a whole Western concept, and the whole concept of owning land. No, how so? Right away, when I see that, and me understanding how it is with continental Africans today coming here, and how they have to the effort it is to acculturate into our system, I already know those are Europeans. They're Europeans in culture. They're Europeans in their outlook. They're definitely not Africans. They're African genetically. So that's an Afro-European. The other one, it sounds like that's a continental African.
Thank you very much.
So, Dr. Patul, if I could ask you a question in terms of that. So there are people who would take that Afro-European and weaponize it to say these people are a part of a colonizing group that came over here with bad intentions. And I personally, I believe everybody had their own reasons, but do you think there is some truth to that?
Yes. Absolutely, because you're talking about, look, I know that the people over here had various cultures and beliefs, but you're talking about a culture over here that was, you had male and female balance. There was a mutual respect for both men and women. Women were not seen as property. And then you're talking about a group of men, regardless of whether they were black or white, whether they were African or pale European, it doesn't matter. They came out of a culture where it's patriarchal.
Mm-hmm.
You understand? You lose your identity once you get married. Marriages back then was a form of ownership. The whole concept of even owning land, whether you were a white European or a black European, it doesn't matter. Both of them believed in it, which was diametrically opposed to the mindset of the people here. So some of it was intentional, okay? Some of it was imperialistic, and then some of it was innocent. It's just you're talking about two different cultures where you can have a clash. I'm a product of it. Okay, so neither party is bad, but you're gonna have a problem sometimes.
Doc, even in today's marriages, the father gives the daughter away.
Right.
Property.
Right, and you're talking about, patrilineal cultures, patriarchal cultures, imperialistic cultures. We have to understand that Yoruba people were very imperialistic. West Africans were very imperialistic. Imperialism doesn't always have to come with a sword, but imperialistic in terms of dominant. Like if you're a woman and you marry a man from Nigeria, the kid in his mind is his identity. As a matter of fact, it took me a while to understand why I was offending many continental Africans. Let me explain, because my father is from Ghana and he was an Akan. And the Akans, the most famous of the Akans were the Ashantis, okay? But he wasn't an Ashanti, he was Kwawu. They're all related and they're matrilineal. So their tribal identity is based on their mother. So my father always told me that, I'm not him because he is his mother, okay? And therefore, he wasn't disowning me. That's tribal heritage. It's not personal. So I was raised like that. So I understand that you can come from a bloodline but you're still not that tribe based on tribal heritage. I grew up understanding that. So, I understand that it's not personal. So when I would meet, let's say, Africans from other countries, whether it's Mali, Nigeria, or whatever, they'll hear my surname, and they will ask me, well, what are you? I'll say, my dad is from Ghana, and my mother is Black American. She's from North Carolina. And they would say to me, then you're Ghanaian. And then I would say, no, I'm not Ghanaian. My dad is Ghanaian. And then it hit me that they were imposing their system of heritage, their way of inheritance onto me, because the truth is the majority of Africans are patrilineal. It just happens that my father's tribe is not. So if you just think about it and you expand, that's basically what happened here. It was men coming out of a culture where what they say goes. We're talking about back then. And that can cause conflict. And also, those cultures are expansive. So you will find that you see West African cultural remnants that were pre-Columbian. You see it in the Caribbean. Look at how widespread Yoruba culture is in the South America zone. It's naive to think that came with the slave trade. It is so widespread that you would know that that was definitely pre-Columbian. And if you look at the DNA of actual West Africans, because more of them are participating, you will see very, very tiny Native American markers from South America to Mesoamerica. So that lets you know, and look, most of their staples actually came from the South American region. So there was trade going back and forth, but in turn, they also carried their culture here. Not so much the other way around. They took the food, but they didn't take the culture. But notice that you see the remnants of their culture all throughout the Americas. Shango and all of those things, that's somewhat of a, not somewhat, it's an imperialistic mindset. It's just not done maybe through bloodshed, but it is a dominant imperialistic mindset.
Indeed. So I'd also like to add, just because you touched on something about not being born, coming from your mother, right? So there are a lot of people that are coming into the knowledge of their ancestry, and that's an important piece to know, right? So what I want to speak to is that there were situations where you would have Native men having babies by whether they were European women or African women, right? In terms of the clanship, you would still be a part of the community, but you would fall out of clanship. And the main reason is that the women teach the culture.
Right.
So if you can only learn your culture from your mother and your mother is African or European, there were processes for these children to be re-adopted into the tribe in terms of, you know what I mean? But at a certain period of time, that wasn't happening. So people would still be a part of the community, but they wouldn't be learning the same way their cousins might be learning. You know what I mean? The cultural exchange isn't as thorough. So there's a lot of people that think that they were stripped of their culture and they don't understand the small nuances of tribal culture. So I just wanted to add that.
Right. But that's the thing. It's basically you're just reiterating what, like my father. It's not that I can't go among them. It's not as nobody's throwing rocks at me or, because I have a blood tie, I'm family. So they throw away their family, but that's their system of inheritance.
Yeah, true. And yeah, that's something I think a lot of people overlook because they don't know how they exactly tie into these tribes, into these communities. So I just thought that was a great point that you made.
Right. Well, for me, so far, for my research, the limited research that I have, so far, it looks like a lot of my tie is coming in paternally. So I'm actually one of those. I mean, just like any Afro-American, yes, I have indigenous ancestors, but I also clearly have Afro-Europeans, but it looks like a lot of it is coming in from the men.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that happens. Absolutely.
I had a quick question for Chris.
Yes.
This is Tracy. I've like I said before, I've taken your test, and I had a question on there about the South Asian Roma.
Sure.
And I was trying to figure, does that show evidence of Native American blood as well? I do have at least 4% on there for Native American.
Okay. Yeah, Tracy, that's really that's a great question. A lot of times I tell people, now this isn't true 100% of the time, but in many cases, I'll tell people when you see Roma ancestry, there's also Native in there somewhere. Now, obviously that's not true 100% of the time, but what I have noticed is, especially with the STR system, the S&P system, it depends on how the calculator parses the data, on how the data types, the individual SNPs, the reference SNPs are divided, how they're binned. But with the STR data especially, I'd say it happens about half the time with the S&P data. But when someone shows initial signs of having Romani ancestry with the STR test, I immediately start looking for that Native American connection. Now, some people could say, well, you're just baiting yourself. You're looking for something that's not there. But I've got some tests, some reduction systems and stuff I can use to help prevent that. But no, and many times it does. And what I have noticed, and others have noticed this too, is with this Eastern tribes, mostly along and east of Interstate 35. So from Oklahoma City, Dallas, Fort Worth, east, and it will increase in frequency as you head east of the Mississippi River. So many of those families that have Romani heritage also had Native American ancestry, and vice versa, both ways. So yeah, in short, it absolutely does many times indicate, because of those Roma people, the Roma slaves that were brought over during the transatlantic voyages, they were in fact intermingling with Native American communities as well, and both were servants at one time or another. So yes, it absolutely can be an indicator of that.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Sure.
Can
Yeah,
I,
you bet.
Okay.
can I,
Tracy, also that 4% that's showing up, that I think Dr. Fatou can probably help you see if that's actually an ancient genetic footprint or a more recent admixture as well.
Okay, Chief, I'm showing because I am seeing some Malaysia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right. A Monongahela, how you say that? Monongahela culture. And there's a Roma, Spain,
Yeah.
Aliu, Alaska, Makrani, Pakistan, Basque, France, and Spain.
Yes.
And some Chinese.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, that Monongahela culture, that's one of our new populations. And yes, it sounds very,
Muskegon.
yes, it
And
sounds
yeah,
Cherokee.
I
Yeah,
do have Cherokee on there as well.
it's fascinating.
But that
what
was
I wanted to,
it. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Finish.
No, I'm finished.
Oh, I just wanted to add for the Romani Gypsy population, when you look at the sequences also, and I saw this, yes, they did intermingle with the native population, the Native American population, without a shadow of a doubt. But for many of us who have the lineage coming out of England, which is pretty much almost all of us, you will see that some of that intermingling with the Romani population took place in England. Okay, so I have seen the Romani Gypsy adjacent to the British DNA. I have seen Romani Gypsy adjacent to the Senegambian DNA. Because remember, all of these populations were in England just like they were in Spain. This is why you find when you see people from Latin American backgrounds, they will also get some of these matches to India, Pakistan, and the Balkan DNA because of the Romani Gypsies that were a big presence in the Iberian Peninsula and Spain and places like that. So yes, there was mixing that went on between those populations when they came here from Europe, but there was mixing going on in Europe. So some of the Europeans that came here were already mixed. I mean, nobody is pure. Does that sound right, Chris?
Yes, I absolutely do believe that some of that mixing, that admixture, was introduced in Western Europe with the African people that were there amongst the Romani as well. Absolutely, yeah. The Western expansion of the Romani people out of South Asia, mostly India, Western India, and southern Pakistan, happened about 800 to 1,000 years ago. And so, I mean, the timeline on that obviously is more than capable of allowing for something like that. So, yes.
Swin, everyone. There was a question inside of the chat that really stood out. with the GED match, could you explain why the African DNA doesn't show up, but Russian, Indian, German, and Asian shows up in the archaic? Why is that so?
Well, which Jet Match oracle are you referring to?
I'm referring to the archaic GED match when you do the one to the archaic DNA.
And I'm trying to understand your question, and you would like to know why. Oh, you're
The
talking about the archaeogenetic section
Yes,
where you
ma'am.
look at the actual what do they call that? It's like you see the tongue tied. Well, you look and you see the matches to the
Yes, ma'am.
different. Okay, so I'm sorry. Now I see what you're talking about. So I'm sorry. Repeat the question.
So with the archaic DNA, when they go back, it doesn't show African, but it shows Russian, it shows Asian, it shows the German, the Indian, and the Asian markers from skeletal or DNA from samples that they took. Why is that?
Because they simply don't have in their base, they don't have the African DNA as a reference. But what they do have is, now check this out. What they do have is the Neanderthal that's there.
Yes, I saw that.
Right. Now, if you take that GED match kit, which is Neanderthal, okay, and you plug it into any of those oracles, you would see that Neanderthal is 98%, depending on the oracle, anywhere from 95 to 98 to almost 100% African.
Correct. I see that. But from
Exactly. So that was a archaic being. But to answer your question, they just simply did not provide us with ancient skeletons that were of an African ancestral composition. That's all. It doesn't mean they didn't exist. We know the Ibermerusians is the oldest African DNA that we have. I'm not going to say the oldest skeleton, but the oldest African DNA going back like 10,000 BC in North Africa. So, but it's just they chose not to share it there for whatever reasons. It's more geared towards European DNA. However, you have Otzi there.
Right.
I know what you're talking about. You have Otzi there, and if you look at Otzi's ancestral composition, you will see that he's 30. I can't remember the exact percentages,
33.
but roughly he's 30% African. He's 30% South Asian, 30% Native American. So Otzi is a very brown man who has a multitude of ancestries. That's just the creators of that particular test. That's just their bias. They just did not provide
So
us
you do
with.
believe it's biased. So you do believe it's
Oh,
biased.
there's always absolutely biases in the creation of those models. I mean, because for
Okay.
example, if you've already predetermined before you create a computer-generated model that the population on the East Coast, let's say someone belongs to a tribe, they already know who they are. If you've already predetermined that person is African because I see curly hair and brown skin, if you've already predetermined that, then you will create the model on that premise. This is some of why we get the results that we get.
That's the best answer you gave right there.
The key is to understand it, and this is why I studied it.
So based on that model, if traditional Africans are phenotypically, skeletally different from the Negro American, how does that tie together? If these tests are valid in any way?
Well, if you're talking about GEDmatch, you are going to pick up the similarities. Like, let's say, for instance, my cousin, who's a full Ghanaian, and my brother, he's my half brother, biologically my half brother. They are full Ghanaian. So I've looked at their DNA and a number of full West Africans' DNA. Well, what they share in common with us is that the older part of them goes back to the Bantu Great Lakes area. It goes back to other areas, but that's definitely one of the most ancient parts of the West African. And when you look at those of us who have more of an ancient lineage to the Americas, our primary genetic similarity is to the Bantu population. And as a matter of fact, that's what blows holes into this whole thing, that we came from West Africans, because we are primarily genetically similar to the most ancient part of them. The West African is actually younger than the Bantu type African. The West African is fairly new on the scene. Not all Africans are of the same age.
And so the Bantu was a global. It was a global.
Global. And I would say that of the West Africans, Yoruba come next. They were expansionists. They were very imperialistic. They may not have done it through violence, but they were imperialistic. We just talked about that. But when you start talking about Mandinka, Senegambian, which is like the Senegambian, the Malians, but they're fairly new on the scene. They haven't been here that long genetically.
Okay. I appreciate you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Fatou. Thank you, guys, for your questions. Do we have any more questions before we end this? I know we've been on for a while. It's been a great interview. A lot of information, and the interaction has been awesome. With the questions pulling out even more information. So, do we have any more questions before we call it?
I did have one
All right.
question for the JED match. What's the best? I'm trying to think of the way to say it. The best parameters as far as setting it up to get the most accurate answer as far as what your makeup is.
I think you should look at a number of the tests. That's the key. The MDLP, the MDLP 22, the MDLP 16 Martin. Look at it all, because they all have their strengths. For example, with that's pretty good for the people we're calling Native American and Asian derived population natives. Okay, but like I said, they've been here for 10,000 years, and we mixed with them. So you will see for some of us, the Colville shows up in the secondary populations with the MDLP plain and the MDLP 22. And that basically coincides with the findings with Chris Lusaka's test results. Some of us get Salish, Native American, right, Chris? Salish, Native American, and that's the same thing as the Colville that's showing up in GEDmatch, because the Colville are Salish-speaking people. So some of us end up with those matches on native DNA as well. But, those are, and then if, for example, if you want to look at the evidence of the Romani Gypsy DNA, the MDLP 22 and the MDLP show, if you look at the secondary populations and you see Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, that's very suggestive of Romani DNA, because you had a lot of mixing with those Balkan Europeans and the Romani population. So it shows up in our DNA with those types of matches. And then also, if you go to the Punt DNAL, which is another oracle, that's designed to highlight or to look at the South Asian influence. So for those of us who put our raw data in that, it comes up as Baloch. The Baloch people will be more or less the people out of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and you will notice that we get percentages, a certain amount of percentages, and some South Indian DNA. In my family's case, I get very little South Indian, but more Baloch, which is like more Pakistan, Afghanistan. That's all from the Not all of it, but a lot of it is from that Romani Gypsy DNA because many of them are more related to the North Indian, Northwest Indian people. So, it depends on what you want to look at. If you look at the Eurogenes, 13, the different Eurogenes, the Eurogenes V215, the Eurogenes 13. It's a more rudimentary type of breakdown, but it's still insightful because you will see the Northeast African there. And we know that the Egyptians came here. We also know that the Moors have a certain amount of Northeast African matches to Somali and Ethiopia, which we do see on many of us African Americans, Afro American people, and even people who belong to the tribes. And that's all signals that you see with the Moors or the Afro Europeans that came out of Europe because they were genetically very similar to the Amazigh people out of North Africa. Again,
I know I did a
what?
CRI. I'm sorry. I did CRI genetics, and they show you your long distance, and then they'll show your last 5 generations. And within the last 5 generations, I found out I was like 25.5% German and 13.4% Italian. But I guess the question I'm asking is, could some of that, because I do have some, it looks like the region there, Bulgaria, Pakistan, Hungary, that area. I've got some Slavic, South and Central Slavic. So I was just trying to see if those areas had anything to do with the Romani and Indian.
Yeah, the Hungarian, the Bulgarian, the Romanian with the Pakistani, that's all suggestive of Romani Gypsy DNA.
And I also, with that CRI genetics, they'll show you like who famous people you're related to. And I found out I'm a direct descendant to the Juanita mummy of Peru, which I thought was interesting because it was like, wow, that's way over. Yeah.
That shows you
It's
how.
like by about like 2% or something, which it did show that it went back to around 1450s with that.
Wow.
So I just thought, I was like, wow, because it's just amazing to me that all of these tests, they kind of show you a little bit about just how a little bit of your DNA can determine certain things that you're interested in. It's maybe goes back deep into the DNA. I don't, you know what I mean? Like certain things that people like to eat or places they always wanted to go. And then you find out, oh, well, you have some of this in you.
Yeah.
As strange as that is, I have noticed people that tend to have a fetish for a particular culture. I'm not saying craziness, but like, because I've also seen people just crazy. But I'm talking about like, just they like certain cuisines. I find it mind blowing that when you look at their DNA, they have little traces and parts, bits and pieces of that DNA inside of them.
Yeah.
All right, family. Well, we've been on for over, 7, 8, 9. Yeah, we've been over a little bit over 2 hours. So I am getting ready to call it. And any last words from anyone before we go ahead and conclude this show?
I just want to thank everybody. That was very informative.
I had a question for Chris.
Sure. Yes. Hi.
Hi. I was wondering, how far back does your tests go?
That's a great question. I have seen certain ancestral admixture appear somewhere between 8 and 10 generations back. So much of that depends on, how many ancestors you had from that particular region that you're looking for. But if it was just one ancestor, I would say 8 to 10 generations ago, before those STRs, before they're, washed out, so to say, real scientific term there, I know, but So about 8 to 10 generations typically.
Okay. I I am not like most of the people in my tribe. I am from the Piedmont part of North Carolina,
Absolutely.
and I'm actually like from the Western Piedmont, like right at the foothills
Hmm.
of the mountains. I was curious, have you done research from that area?
Oh, that is a fascinating genetic area. Let me tell you that. Yes, I have. I've tested, oh boy, probably somewhere between 7, 6, 7, 8 people from that area over the years. And one of the things I noticed, and this actually goes back to Tracy Graham's statement where she was talking about the Peruvian influence there. There most
Hmm.
certainly is a Peruvian influence from around I think it's Cherokee related, but I think there were some Peruvian people there's rumors that there was a ship that carried
Hmm.
Peruvian slaves up to the eastern coast of North Carolina back in,
Hmm.
I don't know, 1600s, maybe early 17s. And then those
Hmm.
folks interacted and were absorbed potentially into the native culture there. And there's also the possibility that that could have been Taino related,
Hmm.
that the Caribbean peoples came up, the Arawakan speakers came up into the southeastern U.S. But
Uh-huh.
there's that, and a couple of other signatures would be the Muskogean connection. I have
Uh-huh.
seen Creek, Choctaw in that part of
Hmm.
North Carolina, and
Yeah.
also some of the Siouan ancestry from the Saponi people.
Hmm.
Some late research is indicating that some of the Occaneechi people very significantly interacted with the Cherokee people from southern Appalachia.
Hmm.
And so all that combined, but yeah, that's a fascinating genetic region right in through there. I've seen so many different tribes represented in that part of
Right.
North Carolina. So
Okay.
yeah,
Oh, great. Thank you.
you're welcome.
All right, family. Well, we're getting ready to call it. I want to give a thanks to Dr. Fatu, and I want to give a thanks to Chris for you bringing your expertise on the show. I think everybody got a lot of information and guidance out of what you shared. And I also want to thank all of you who participated and asked questions so we can learn from your questions as well. Elder Shadow, War Turtle, Blue Feather, Tracy Standing Deer, He Who Walks with Medicine, Spirit Warrior. And if I'm leaving anybody out, I apologize, but I really thank all of y'all for coming on and having this experience with us. So family, thank you, Yahweh. We're going to call it. Appreciate you
Yeah.
all for joining Waterwake Radio and being on the show.
Thank you so much.